proof is he's a jerk, which
Pretty much.
liked. So Tara, you've been an early promoter of diversity, but you've been working in technology for a long time. You had the pleasure of working with Netscape. Whoever remembers Netscape, I definitely do. And also had a brush off with Pixar Studios. Who doesn't remember beautiful Pixar creations? Well, and recently you joined, well, not so recently, but the latest career is with Google, where you manage a team. So, Tara, what led you, let's start with the question, what led you to this very creative and very challenging career path?
Well, I have to say it was mostly pure happenstance. I graduated from UC Santa Cruz, it's a public university here in California, and didn't have a particularly good idea of what I was going to do. Ironically, I had specialized in very early primitive graphics and animation in my computer science program, but I graduated too late to take advantage of a big hiring that a company called SGI was doing at the time, which was the company, if you recall, was responsible for basically inventing modern computer graphics in a very real way. And they were the ones who invented the dinosaurs for Jurassic Park. But I was a little too late for that. And instead, I got a job doing development infrastructure, build and release engineering, and other types of sort of platform type of tooling, and discovered my true passion. I actually discovered that I love the art of how we make software and how we can improve it and make it more efficient. And so that's what I ended up doing at my first job, and I've been doing it ever since.
Excellent, Tara. That's really fascinating. Your career was quite challenging, I would say, because everybody is dreaming of getting these big names in their portfolio, in their CV, and I'm not sure everybody succeeds. So what was the concept of, did you really always aim for the biggest names, or was it, you were the chosen one?
No, not at all. So my first job I got, the one where I discovered infrastructure, that was one of two companies that tended to hire a lot of UC Santa Cruz graduates. And so I had lots of people that I knew there who recommended me. So it was a very sort of self-fulfilling kind of system. And from there, I went to Netscape. Netscape at the time, it was still a very small company, around 200 people. I think I was number 215, something like that. And the reason that I got the job at Netscape is because there was a whole lot of people at my first company who had left that company and gone to Netscape. And they're like, well, we need people who do this stuff. So I got dragged along. And every subsequent job for, I don't know, the next 3 or 4 positions was built on that network of knowing people. And it's not because I was some, crazy founder or the source of radical ideas, but it was because my passion was, how do we operate as an organization efficiently and productively? And so from Netscape, and I think Beta, you and I talked about how when we released the open source of the first browser, commercial browser, as open source, which founded Mozilla.org, we also released the tools that we had used to develop it, a bug tracking system, a early version of continuous integration. And so me being part of that process and those projects made it very helpful, because at the time, the commercialization of infrastructure type tools hadn't really happened yet. And so just like starting to be known as someone who can come in and kind of help you get going and help your developers, people wanting to work with me again was really what it is. And it has proven incredibly valuable, because I'm not actually the sort of person who seeks out these big names. The Pixar job in particular, I got because my vice president at the previous company, I got laid off. It was going through a downturn. It was the first big bubble bust back in 2001, 2002. He knew the hiring manager at Pixar. A lot of the people at Pixar had worked at SGI. and in the early days for computer graphics. So they had ended up at Pixar. And so my vice president called and said, hey, you need somebody who is going to help your developers be more efficient and productive. You really should give Tara a call. And I ended up going to Pixar and was there for 11 years. So it was quite the path. But it really didn't feel like anything that I was directing. It just felt like if I left myself open to the possibilities of things happening in a good way and just trying to take advantage of those possibilities when they happened, was kind of the best approach I could take.
Fantastic. So today's topic is, we are going to talk about innovation, Tara. And I'm just wondering, because I don't see any questions coming, and I think one of the critical pointers for innovation is being curious and asking questions. And actually, scientific approach is apparently ask at least 5 questions to narrow down and actually understand. And it's very often used in startups. I'm a startup founder and mentor, and I'm really passionate about narrowing down the why. So just as a sideline, please, whoever is watching, and I know you are watching, whether it's Facebook, whether it's YouTube, please join us and ask questions. So when it comes to innovation, what other critical pointers would you mention that are critical in the process of innovation?
So to me, there's 2 really critical things, and both of them come back to organizational culture. There was a study that was done by a company here in the United States called Boston Consulting Group. And they determined over, I don't know how long it took, but it was, they interviewed 1,700 companies over 7 or 8 countries, and showed, and I have a chart here somewhere that I can share actually, showed that the more diverse a company is, the more likely it is that they are benefiting financially from innovation. Here's this chart.
Excellent. We see Olga is very active and she's just commenting. Let's wait for the chart. Thank you, Olga. I hope there is an interesting question from you. You're always challenging our speakers, so we are more than welcome questions related to not only innovation, but also to Tara's career. So yes, I am aware of that interesting. So here we are, the Boston Consulting Group. Companies with above average diversity also have higher innovation revenues.
And there's a really good reason for that, right? It's if you have, oops, sorry, let me stop the screen share. If you have a homogeneous set of employees, let's say in the Bay Area, if everybody who was your employee had graduated from Berkeley or Stanford, for example, you are over-indexing on their experience, the classes that they took, the professors that they learned from. There is not a lot of opportunity for innovation because everybody has the same background, right? If instead you have a mixture of Berkeley and Stanford and perhaps San Jose State, which is a public college here in the Bay Area, as well as other schools across the country or even the world, or even people who did not go to school who are self-taught in computer science or computer science type fields. That's a variety of thought process and viewpoint and experience that collectively, you hope, allows for that innovation to potentially emerge. You have people interacting with each other, feeding each other ideas, bouncing ideas off of each other. From there, you get that expanded experience. Now that's part 1. Part 2 is the other side, and again, it's cultural, which is how does your organization handle experimentation, support it? I describe innovation as being the result of fearless creativity, right? And I'm a big fan of the DevOps philosophy. I think we've talked about that a little bit. And in the DevOps philosophy, there was, and say, a DevOps report and the Accelerate book that was written about it. One of the things they called out was the cultural element of what makes organizations more successful. And there was a sociologist named Ron Westrom who describe different types of organizational cultures, from the pathological, which is kind of the stereotypical, boss man, nobody tells the boss man no. If a messenger brings bad news, they're fired, that kind of sort of extreme example. The other side of that is generative, which is there's a shared sense of ownership and responsibility, and that failures are not punished, but rather rewarded. And just that simple idea is so incredibly powerful, because if you feel like if you have an idea and you fail at trying to execute it, you're going to get fired or demoted or some other negative aspect, you don't really feel inspired to try it. And yet, unless you're willing to try these ideas to see what works, what doesn't work, and most importantly, when it doesn't work, understand why, right, in a successful and positive way, you're not going to get that. So those two things, I think, are super critical to innovation. Not being overly committed to a particular type of employee, go wide. That can be educational backgrounds, ethnic background, gender, could include any number of things. And then have this concept of the Western generative culture, meaning that as an organization, we support each other in having these really cool ideas and trying them and learning from the failures and trying again. These two things together are what make for a successful financial outcome in the end. Also is really good for retaining employees.
Oh, definitely. We just have a first comment from Fran, who was one of the speakers. Completely agreed that diversity is an innovator and enabler. Building a company culture does not mean having Xerox companies, but a diverse, agile, and mobile strategy which harnesses the best out of a diverse talent pool. Because none of us can get to ideas on our own. We need that creative power, and we need that challenging process of disruption. This is what is bringing disruption, and it's actually bringing me bringing my thoughts to an interesting example of one of the mentors who visited a prison and in America, and they were trying to nurture innovation there. And it turned out that prisoners had such different ideas, because some of them grew up in prison. They didn't have or didn't experience the technology world. So they were thinking about completely different problems to solve. So definitely, I would agree. I wouldn't advise you to go to prison. That's not what I mean. But definitely, that is something you can benefit if you are planning to be innovative. So you mentioned one thing, that you need to nurture the culture. You need to make sure that everybody is listened to and is being considered. And I'm thinking about Thomas Edison, when he came to Britain and he wanted to get the idea of light. And actually what they said about his idea was, and that's a quote, unworthy of the attention of practical or scientific men. So how do you nurture that culture of failure? Because I think the biggest dynamic that stifles innovation and business and everybody's progress is being afraid of what other people think. So how is it happening in your culture, in your company, in your structure? How do you nurture that ecosystem?
I think there's a combo, right? It's that the fear of failure is one element. And then there's the element of complacency. Like, I've got where I wanted to get, don't change anything, right? Change is hard. And so being willing to embrace and adapt in the face of change and supporting change is super critical. And where often you see, we talk about anti-patterns in DevOps, there's like things that you don't do. And I think it's true beyond DevOps philosophy. But the biggest anti-pattern for around change and innovation is having people in a position of power who are not bought into the value of innovation and of change, right? They're in their position, they're comfortable, they don't want it to be disruptive, and because they're in that position, they're able to stifle anything that they feel is going to disrupt their comfort, to be frank, right? They don't want to risk anything. And that's where that concept of shared responsibility, shared ownership as a cultural value becomes really critical. If the CEO is the person who feels that way, well, your company is probably doomed, right? At some point, it's going to fail. because it's not keeping up. And particularly in high-tech industry, things change constantly. If the CEO is not that person, it's someone in their staff or somewhere in the management stream. That person needs to be identified and needs to be shaped up or shipped out. The cultural element has to be universally applied. And that's something that often fails. It's like, oh, here, we're going to make a team and they're going to go off and they're going to figure out the next big thing and bring it back to us, right? That tends to fail because the rest of the company is not bought into it. They're under potentially no particular obligation to adopt whatever that team has done. This is a classic DevOps anti-pattern, actually, is to make a DevOps team and have them go off and figure something out. And then nobody wants to buy into it because it's change, right? And so from the CEO down to, whatever your lowest level is, that idea of embracing change as a positive value proposition is just, without that, you really have no chance of success.
I am thinking about this great tissue in our brain, myelin, that is really making
for the nerves.
Sure that, yes, actually, it makes sure that we are getting better and we are using the pattern and we are not going off the charts and we then are more comfortable. So we talked about the being in comfort zone and going outside of the comfort zone with previous topics. We were actually tackling fear. Maybe you have some experience with tackling fear, or what was your biggest failure when you started?
Okay, I have a good one. So when I was at Pixar, just started in the first year, I was so the reason that I came to Pixar was to help evolve their software development process so that they could go from one movie every 4 to 5 years to, I think the ultimate goal was 3 movies every 2 years, right? So a movie every 18 months, something like that, which meant because the software that's used to make the movies at Pixar is, even now, is still heavily proprietary. They have their own software development team. They had to be able to use branches and other sorts of software development best practices that the rest of the industry was using. Pixar hadn't had to do that yet. It was a lot of the Pixar technology evolved in a more sort of academic project kind of mindset because it was so early and so new. And so bringing in the ideas of continuous integration and automated testing and those types of things, like how do we make this work in a movie studio environment? Because even though there's software going on, at the end of the day, it's a movie studio. It has different motivations. One of the ways that tools were distributed to the developers was there was an NFS mount, so a shared file system that every computer in the studio mounted. And so you did not install tools locally on your machine. You just had a mount that had all the tools on it. And that way, if there were a change to the tool, everybody got that change more or less simultaneously, which could be very important because on the workstations, you had the technical directors or animators that were doing something using a particular tool set. When they sent off their render request to the render farm also needed to have that tool set. It's thousands of computers that had to be done in sync. And you might think it doesn't scale. It doesn't scale, but Pixar is actually about 1,000 people, so 1,200 plus maybe a couple tens of thousands of cores in the render farm. So it worked for this system. So one day I had an update to the tools, and what I thought I was doing was testing on the test server before I pushed it live. And in fact, what I did is I pushed my testing to the main server and ended up wiping out all of the tools, which broke every workstation, which in the middle of the night, that was okay. No one was there, but it also broke the render farm. And so all of the night's renders this was The Incredibles at the time, all the night's renders failed. So the next morning I come to work and there's this stack of emails that I'm going through. I'm like, oh no, what did I do? And the next thing I know, the office door slams open. Pixar has offices. I do miss that. The office door slams open and there's Rick Sayre, who was the supervising technical director for The Incredibles, which is basically he was the one step below director for all of the effects, lighting, anything that it was not animation. This guy was in charge of, and just like flames leaping out of his ears and just and he didn't even speak loudly, but the menace was just dripping. And I have never been so terrified in my life. And I quickly got it fixed and I never did that again.
Definitely, that's the best way to learn from mistakes. I've heard that apparently second part of Toy Story was wiped up almost. That was another fascinating story of how technology can get wrong. We've got some questions, and this is an interesting, challenging, I would say, from Olga. Can too much diversity drive corporate anarchy? Or is that an issue on the adversity compliancy scale?
That's a fascinating question. I think I know what you're asking. Uh, Here's the thing. To me, nothing happens out of context of everything else. So when you are looking at diversity of thought that arises from diversity of employees, meaning the various things that can make an employee a diverse set of people, you're wanting to think about it in your larger context. You don't just do it to do it. There's a great example. And I've used this in my talks a couple of times. There's a video that's going around. If you Google racist soap dispensers, you'll see examples of this where a man who has very dark skin tries to put his hand under an automatic soap dispenser and it doesn't work because the light sensors cannot get enough light bounce back off of his skin to detect that his hand is there. So instead he has to put a white paper towel on his hand, and now all of a sudden the soap dispenser works. So there's an example. This is not software necessarily. It's physical sensor, but it's an example of clearly they did not have any dark-skinned people test the sensor before they sold it, right? And there's a couple of versions of this. Another one is VR head rigs, so an Oculus or an HTC Vive. These were created apparently not with a lot of women involved, because it's turned out that somewhere between 75 and 80% of all women who try a VR rig get motion sickness. Women have a slightly different physiology. The way that our hips make our posture and where we carry our weight and how our head sits on our bodies there's enough subtle differences that it makes a huge difference in how we experience VR through these rigs. Well, that's millions of potential dollars of lost revenue because women aren't going to use something that's going to make them throw up, right? This is what I mean by what kinds of diversity do you need? If you are a company that wants to sell, let's say that you're in Europe, but you see that there's a huge market in South America for your product, whatever it is, you're going to probably want to have people from those countries helping you understand how to sell, how to market, what are some of the critical things that you're going to want to understand in order to make sure that you're developing those products in the most successful way, right? So there are so many different ways that you can look at this, and it's really understanding as a whole, like the zeitgeist of you, if you will, of your corporate culture. Is it helping you achieve your end means? If all you're ever going to do is sell to rich old white guys, that's going to be pretty easy. But there's a lot more to this world than old rich white guys. They're fine. That's not saying anything bad about them, but it's like understanding, what are you trying to do? If you're trying to reach the world, you need to have the world represented in your employee base, because they're going to help you do that.
It's like baking bias into the system. When we look at the AI, and I would say there is a lack of female leaders in artificial intelligence, and what it might bring potentially. We've heard the story of IBM, where AI recognized, it was very very precise, 93% recognition of faces. But if you narrow it down, it turned out that it's only 23% accuracy when it deals with darker skin, and especially darker skin of females. So definitely that's a huge potential and huge opportunity missed by many companies. So we've got another, definitely diversity is a critical component in innovation. We've got another question from Fran, who's asking, in your experience, what is the key ingredient missing in business today? What stops them from innovating? And here is an interesting fact I read about CEOs. 97% of them believe innovation is critical, but only half of them use tools to nurture innovation in their culture.
So I have an answer that I think works well in the United States. I don't know how well it works in Europe. I think it depends on where you're at and what business that you are. But certainly in the United States, one of the things that I have seen as an absolute killer is impatience. Innovation isn't necessarily fast, right? And because of how the internet, sort of the ecosystem of the internet has evolved, everything is getting faster and faster and faster. You have to bring ideas to market within months, where previously it could have been years. And that means that the ideas that need more time to develop may not get that time. You have, once you go public, this is, to me, a company going public is, I almost mourn this, because it changes everything. Now you're beholden to the shareholders, and you have to make sure they stay happy, and the shareholders always want to see growth. Well, if you don't have the ideas driving your business to create that growth, which can take time, the other way you show growth is by reducing the number of employees that you have and trying to sustain the business, basically reducing your cost of operations, and you just make bad business decisions. So, again, I don't know how bad this may or may not be in Europe. I suspect it's probably, at least in certain industries, has infected Europe and the rest of the world as well. But it is having the time and keeping that space open to develop those really amazing ideas, to do the research. You have to have data. You need to understand, what does marketing do? They go out and they figure out, what's the appetite for a particular idea? Where are the things that we think if we made the right investment, we could make an impact into? Those things take time, and you have to be willing to invest in it. So if you're just in a hurry to make as much money as quickly as possible, you're going to lose out on a lot of opportunity, I suspect. And that's, I think, why so many companies come up and down so quickly, right? It's looking for that quick fix.
Absolutely. And I think also another factor is many companies, what I've seen in Malta, they were waiting for the decision by the government, not really doing anything in terms of innovation. Well, we've seen some examples of some restaurants actually trying to pivot and being online, and all of a sudden being more technology savvy, and these are good examples, but actually majority of them were just waiting. And I guess also innovation is really tricky when you are working from home. You don't have this water cooler moment when you can bounce off ideas, and you don't really have that face-to-face meeting. And it's very tricky to actually say what you mean in the email.
Well, technology allows us to adapt. I think I've certainly seen evidence of a lot of different ways of trying to address this. Having time where you set up a Google Meet or a Zoom with no particular agenda, you're just hanging out with each other. One of my teams actually set that up and also did a shared digital jigsaw puzzle together. And we're talking, and for all I know, they came up with some interesting ideas for their next project out as part of that. So is it as good as being able to sit down at lunch with someone and kind of talk through things? No, but you can make some adaptations. And there's a lot of tools now that previously existed or are now coming online to also help with that. Things like a Jamboard and what's the other one? But basically, where you have digital whiteboards where multiple people are interacting in some ways. You can create charts and digital stickies, and with a little imagination, you can try and replicate some of those ideas. But the bottom line is, as an organization, the biggest thing that you can do is to incentivize it, right? It's not just saying, well, try it and fail, and we won't punish you if you fail. It's, no, we really want you to try and come up with an idea, right? And we're going to encourage you to do that. We're going to provide incentives for you to do that. People are creative. They'll come up with their own ways of figuring out how to create that, those ideas and how to nurture it. But they have to know that it's going to be valued.
And it's okay to fail, because I think it's the biggest
and that
problem.
It's okay to fail, right? right?
Yes,
And I think going back to an earlier question around that idea of anarchy, it comes into play here too, which is you need to have constraints, right? If there's an idea and it's like, I don't know, you have to say, all right, well, you have this much time to figure out whether or not it's a good idea. Okay, now that you've gotten this is your next milestone. And you have to say and be clear about these are the milestones that need to be met along the way in order for you to demonstrate progress, to know whether or not should we continue to invest in this area or not, right? It's not just willy-nilly. So you need structure, but you need a lot of positive structure.
Laura, I'm going to get back to your lengthy discussion. Now it's Charlene who says, sometimes the biggest obstacle is not having enough time to come up with new ideas. And I would agree with that. But how much of your personal life do you spend pondering on opportunities or on bringing new ideas? And actually, I think, because I'm also, and you are also, Tara, a member of the board, I think the biggest challenge for any board member or any chairman is making sure that every voices are heard and every idea is taken into consideration. So how do you span this time of when do you have time? So as an example, in Japan, I've heard every Monday morning they gather to talk about what happened last week and what they are planning to do next week. And that's an interesting way of delving into ideas. What would be your advice? How to actually find time to come up with ideas?
Well, so that's, I think that's a part of that whole incentivizing, right? Is that as an organization, you dedicate time and space for those things to happen. Google actually has a pretty famous process that they have. I think a lot of other companies have emulated as well, called the 20% project, right? Where you get as much as 1 day a week to do something other than your regular job, and that's okay. Right. And I can point at Gmail as a huge success story, right? It started out as a 20% project and now has over 1 billion daily active users. Right? I mean, that's sort of the unicorn version of it. But it is building it into your cultures that you do have the time to do that. Or maybe you have an idea, but you don't feel that you have the time to act on that idea, or that you're not sure that you are the one who has the skills to implement it, but there's a system by which you could share that idea and somebody else might pick it up, right? And so it's creating that ecosystem, that structure around fostering ideas being created, not putting any particular pressure or impetus on just the act of having an idea, right? But then letting people lift an idea and try and run with it in order to see what happens. And it just, you have to build it into your system. And it has to be part of the average workday, right? You don't want to force people to have to spend time away from work trying to think of things to do in work, right? That leads to burnout.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, not daydreaming. That actually brings us back to square one, which is diversity in its totality. We need to have different brains at different stages of life, not just old guys, but also young guys or girls who can bring some new ideas and see around them what opportunities are missed within the company culture. So I heard this thesis, which is size stifles innovation. So the bigger the company is, the bigger the company culture, that is the obstacle for innovation. How is it in your experience?
That certainly can be true. And, if you believe my opinion, some of that stems to now you have people who are at a big company in an executive position and they're comfortable. And so that comfort, that kind of complacency can kind of trickle down and become part of the management culture as well. Not all companies. Google, now I've been at Google for a couple of years now, and they try really hard not to do that. But, there's probably elements of Google that are more successful than others. And Google, in some ways, may take it to too much the extreme. Maybe it's a little bit too of the anarchist type of mindset on how they do it. I mean, it's a system, right? It's a system that has to not only match your company's goals, but the employees that you have. which means there's no one right way, I think is another element of it. But again, it also comes back to, at the executive level, what's the value that the company wants to have? Do they want to invest in innovation? Then they need to take a really hard look at what they are doing logistically within the company to support it and foster it. If they think it's just something that their employees are going to randomly come up with periodically that they get to benefit from, it's not going to happen, right? And probably what's going to happen is the employees are going to leave and start their own company and take advantage of themselves, right? It's intentional.
Absolutely.
I think is the biggest thing. It has to be intentional.
Absolutely. So here's a question from the investor or VC venture capital focus. Laura has been working on the VC side of things, and she's asking the VC, and here is the thesis: the VC and funding model sometimes hinder innovation or supports innovation that can sometimes be seen as smoke and mirrors because implementation after MVP is slow or does not get completed, minimal viable project. What do you think needs to change in the investor VC landscape and the behavior so we can ensure there is quality innovation, driving solutions for real problems?
If I had a good answer for that, I'd start my own fund. So this is a great question. Here's the thing that I think is the big challenge there. In an ideal circumstance, you'll have incubators. Y Combinator is a very famous example. There are many others. And ideally, you have this idea, you go into incubation, you try and develop something. If you meet, again, going back to having a structured criteria, a definition for success, if you meet your milestones, hey, you're trending well, we're going to invest in you, right? But what ends up happening, I think, in too many cases is you have a lot of funds. And they're always on the lookout for the next big thing because, they have to give their money out and then give a return to the investors who contributed to that fund. And so there's the FOMO, the fear of missing out, right? It's like, oh, that's a really great idea. Let's throw money at it because if we don't, then that SoftBank guy is going to come in and, give it $100 billion. The downside is a lot of money gets thrown at things that aren't properly vetted yet. I mean, we could point at WeWork, like, should WeWork have gotten $1 billion? I don't know. Maybe not. But the problem is that this is a problem that's industry wide. And I don't know how we could fix this as an industry because it only takes that, one super rich fund investor to screw it up for everybody. So that's a really tough one. I mean, personally, if I was going to found a company, which I am very unlikely to do, that's not the thing that motivates me. But were I to do that, I would do it without VC funds. To me, that just seems crazy complicated. Start with a couple of people, start to build a customer base, do it the old fashioned way, go really slow, and just kind of evolve it over time. And that's the sort of the antithesis of how the internet is now, though. Now it's all about go as fast as possible. But this is why I don't found companies.
Yeah, well, the topic today is adversity breeds innovation, and I actually cannot stop thinking about bootstrapping is the way to do it because, as you said, if you were in that field, you would definitely start small. So I am just wondering now, when we delve into finance and minorities and diversity, I'm actually thinking about you because you're a perfect example. You're just like a picture perfect. You've got funny surname. You don't look like a typical, I don't know, female with makeup and stuff. So why not running a fund?
Well, I think for me personally, I don't run a fund for the same reason I became a manager, which is I love working with people. Like I've written code. I'm okay. I was never particularly amazing at it, but I got by. But it's the people challenge is what really drove me. And I frankly always think the best of people, or always try to. And I think you need a little bit more viciousness to run a fund because you have to be willing to challenge everything. I'm more of a let's try it, and if it doesn't work, let's try something else. That works for me. That works great in like day to day. Like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Let's try that. Right. That's harder when you're dealing with millions of dollars of other people's money. And so for me, that I just don't think I have the right wherewithal.
Well, I definitely am going to send you the questionnaire.
But I know people who are like that, right? And I'm glad that they're there.
Excellent. That's fabulous, because we need all the help we can get. Because if you look at the landscape, there is less than 2% of female funded with VC money. There is definitely a huge potential and lots of money to be made. So thank you, Laura, for praising my my question, because that's definitely something we can talk about. And here is Olga back again with another great question. How does the adversity of COVID-19 and the post-COVID economy change the dynamics of innovation? That's a tricky one and very up-to-date.
That's a great question. There are so many ways I could answer that. So from my perspective, I would, I'll describe this a couple different ways. One, companies that have not been able to easily adapt to a distributed remote workforce are, definitely struggling and will continue to struggle. And frankly, some of them should deserve to go away. I mean, I've heard some horror stories about companies that, kept their employees in the office until the last possible second, and then required their employees to be running 20, webcams to make sure they're working. I'm like, wow, okay, that's never a place I'd ever want to touch as an employee or an investor or anything. I mean, that's just madness. So there's that kind of sort of cultural adversity. Those companies are going to lose the good people who are going to go to companies who are like, pay, go, here's $1,000 to set up your home office, knock yourself out, right? There's that element. Another piece of COVID-19 that I really worry about is so many amazing ideas on, contact tracing. There's a lot of people who are looking at that. Coming in and helping out the United States. There was a big, I don't know if you heard this, a big brouhaha about the old COBOL mainframes that were running unemployment systems. And they're like, oh, COBOL is terrible. I was like, no, COBOL was great, but that system's 30 years old. I mean, that's madness. Why didn't you upgrade it, right? But are the things that are replacing it something that's sustainable? You can look at that COBOL mainframe now and mock it, but it ran for 30 years without anybody taking care of it. That's stellar quality, frankly. And somebody comes in and is like, okay, we're going to throw this PHP and Java code together, and it's on a cloud virtual machine. Go. Like, who's going to maintain that, right? So there's that hurry up, but what's the long tail, right? And I think that's where we may run into problems as an industry. And then post-change, what does it mean to maintain that culture where you are incentivizing and supporting creativity, that fearless creativity that leads to innovation? This is something that's hard as human beings because we want to be within a group. And if we're starting to become less that way, like I think Google, Facebook, a couple of other companies, Slack, they're all like, yeah, we're all working from home for the rest of the year at least. That will have been 9 months of remoteness. And I'm hoping that out of that we start to get better and figure out those ways to recreate those social interactions in a digital way that feels as natural as possible. And I know it's not going to be exactly the same, but we have to figure that out, because I suspect that this isn't going to be the last time we have to deal with something like this. So it goes back to some of the principles of DevOps, is lots of iteration, analyzing failures, trying again. And being okay with that process, because I think it's going to take a while.
So we talked about DevOps, and actually I want to come back to this topic we tackled on the very first, one of the first PhD we were talking about design thinking as a tool to nurture innovation and to bring some ideas. And I actually compared it to a pot with popcorn. You've got ideas that are popping out, and design thinking is the lid that keeps the popcorn together intact inside the pot. So I'm thinking about DevOps. How is it going to help other companies, not necessarily technology related, that could be, what are the tools that could be applied? applied for these companies?
Well, if I'm understanding your question correctly, so DevOps is a way of enabling agile methodologies, right? And agile methodologies say that you need to vet your ideas with your customers as early as possible, so that you start to create a feedback loop, so that you're constantly course correcting the things that you're trying to create in a way that increasingly has validity with your customer base. DevOps then says, okay, given that, how fast can we make those iterations happen? How long does it take from that? Let's say you have an idea, you prototype it, you take it to the customer says, I love all of this except for those 4 things. Those are terrible. It needs to be different. And that gets validated maybe by a couple of customers. And so do you have the system, the infrastructure, and the mindset within your development organization to make those changes really fast and of high quality, so that you can get the next version of that out in front of the customer within days, weeks, whatever, some short time period? And it's that sort of that whole system of trying something, getting the feedback, getting the data, tweaking it, trying again. DevOps says, ideally, you can do that in very short amount of time, but there's a lot of investment that has to go in order to create that, right? You have to set up all of your pipeline and your automation systems, and that can be, and then maintain them, and that can be a lot of work and be very expensive. But it's that concept of investment. We're investing in engaging with the customer. It means you have your sales engineers, and your marketing and product managers and all those folks engaging, distilling that data, transferring that into a requirement spec for your developers, who send that out, quality assessment, back, repeat ad nauseum. And it involves all parts of the company. So that's that DevOps mindset says it is a unified culture to enable fast, innovative creativity. Right. And if your marketing and sales teams aren't bought into this concept, right, it's not going to work. Sales teams like, I got to retire quota. I need good software. It's like, okay, call it GA, ship it. It's like, what? Right. So again, that also comes back to the, that patience, being able to play a little bit of that investment game across the board. It used to be sales teams might spend years carefully curating certain customers and gradually increasing. And I think we need to go back to that in a certain sense.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. I'm just wondering, how is it in your company? How do you hire people to make sure that everybody is buying? And we actually talked with Fran Moisa some time ago about avoiding people who are the no people. So you need to have the ability of saying yes. And how do you actually see these pearls or diamond in the rough?
I actually wrote a blog post about this idea. So in general, I mean, Google has a system that I obviously am now familiar with. I have my own sort of experience in almost 30 years of hiring people in high-tech industry. And I always say that the 2 most important things that I look for in an employee are smart and motivated. If you're smart, you can learn, and the industry is constantly changing. The programming languages are constantly evolving. Half the languages that are tier 1 languages at Google, for example, didn't exist when I got into this industry originally. So it's like being an expert at any particular thing isn't necessarily valuable. It could be helpful for some set of problems, but it's how well are you able and willing to learn? And then motivated is that you are able and willing to learn, and that you're interested in the problems that a given company is solving. I've worked at companies that were e-commerce companies that did SaaS software. I've worked obviously at Pixar. I've worked at a VR company. Not everybody is appropriate for every company. You have to find the people with the smarts and the motivation for the company's products. Once you have that, everything else is just a matter of time and details. And so when you interview, like, okay, I got a bachelor's degree in computer science. Do not ask me what order of efficiency, a binary tree search is. I learned that 30 years ago. I haven't used it since. if somebody asks me that in an interview, I'm not going to go to that company because you're asking me something that's going to have nothing to do with my job, right? You have to really understand, what problems do you need to solve? Ask the candidate, how would you solve this problem? And if they have a good brainstorming session with you and you came out of that with some ideas, like, that's probably the employee that you want to have, right? They may not know how to solve it, but they just gave you some ideas. They just came up with something in an interview that's actionable. That's valuable. So it's really changing that approach and not overemphasizing skills that they're not going to use.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. So, Tara, just a question about your, because we are almost wrapping up. Thank you so much for very engaged audience who are praising you and giving us, as we called it in one of the PhD before, the appreciation signs. So I'm just wondering, in terms of your own experience, because we talked about diversity and how having different people with different backgrounds helps the team. I was wondering, how is your career developed? Is it just you, or is there somebody who you are grateful to today that really helped you to get you to where you are at the moment?
I've had a lot of really great people all along the way. I think if I was going to pick one person, I think I would pick Joy Lenz. She and I worked together at Borland. She was already a manager there. That was my first job out of school. She was the one who hired me to come to Netscape. And then after Netscape, I went to my next company. It was called Blue Martini Software. And I recommended that they hire her to come and be my boss because she's so amazing. She also encouraged me to get into management. She gave me my first book on leadership that I still have because it's amazing. And she's this quirky person. And every time she leaves a company, she says, "Oh, I'm going to retire now." And then she goes away and she gets bored and then she joins another startup. So she's been great, but she's one of many. I've been so incredibly blessed to have some amazing mentors, men and women. My VP at my last company was a balding white guy from Virginia who was probably the best ally I've ever known. Just such a sweetheart, Landon McDowell. So if you ever get a chance to work for him, I recommend it highly. But yeah, being on the lookout, hiring for your own manager, like understanding who you're going to be working for as part of the interview process is so critical, because like a good manager makes all the difference.
So you mentioned Kobo, and I cannot stop thinking when you said about your first mentor, Grace Hopper, the creator of Kobo, who was actually retired, and she had to come back just to help to work on the system further.
It took an act of Congress to get her back because she was in the Navy, and they had to give her an exemption for the age restriction because I think she was in her 80s.
Excellent. Well, we need another Grace Hopper clearly to work on the Kobo and give a little bit of upgrade and maybe some innovative approach. I am wary of the fact we are almost coming to the end of our discussion, and always at the end of our discussion, I ask the question of, imagine the lockdown is over, who would you like to have private breakfast with, and where would you take it?
Oh, okay. So this actually goes back to that whole, why aren't you a VC? There's a woman I admire greatly. Her name is Arlen Hamilton. And she, without any particular background, founded a fund called Backstage. And her intent was to fund, in particular, women and people of color who are hugely underrepresented in most funds. She actually wasn't able to raise all of the money and step back from the position. The fund is still around, but it was an example of an interesting failure. She's since gone on and written a book, and I just love her tenacity because she is actively trying to address a challenge that we have in industry. And so I think she'd be fascinating to have breakfast with. And if I was going to take her out to breakfast, going back to my Santa Cruz days, it's a funky little surf town in the coast of California. And they have a little breakfast place called Zachary's that does sourdough pancakes that are to die for. So sourdough pancakes in Arlen Hamilton is my idea of the perfect professional breakfast.
Fantastic. Well, I hope it comes to light one day or the other. And another question that everybody wants to actually kind of know, because dealing with fear is a tricky one. So I was wondering, how do you deal with fear, and what is your biggest fear?
Well, I mean, to be perfectly frank, I've had fear my whole career. I always, if you've heard the term imposter syndrome, I've always had it since I was in school. I was not meant to be a computer science major or get into high tech. I planned to be a history professor. That was what I wanted to do. And so since I didn't do that, and I'm in this role, I'm always kind of that sense of, at some point people are going to figure out I don't actually know what I'm talking about. That's kind of, my lizard brain feeding me that constant negativity. And so my fear on an ongoing basis is that while some days that voice is quieter and some days it's louder, my fear is that it never goes away. I hope that someday I can figure out how to get rid of it, because I know objectively it's not true. But it is a challenge. And on the other hand, having that experience, I think, has helped me be very empathetic to the people who work for me, or the people that I work with in my company, because we all have the things that cause us to feel nervous, to feel afraid, to judge ourselves as somehow lacking. And the reality is we're all amazing, and we all have different strengths that bring to bear, everybody. And so helping people understand how to get past that is probably the greatest success I ever feel in my role. And I've been very blessed to work with some amazing people who have, I watched them go through that process and overcome it at least as much as I do, which is, well, we succeeded even though we still don't feel like maybe we deserve it, but we're succeeding anyway. And, that's probably the biggest victory one can imagine under those circumstances. And in these times when things are really hard, those lizard brain messages are probably that much louder. So, being able to do stuff like this and remind people that they're not alone and that we can all do this, and we're smart and we're motivated, and just keep that message on point is probably the biggest thing that we can do for each other.
Well, Tara, I can definitely say that there is lots of token of appreciation for you, and we've seen a very motivated and engaged audience today. I have to say that I was really impressed, and please never forget that you made it to Positivity Hack Delivered. So you're definitely worthy of the attention, and definitely I can also testify that one of the important, what I've learned about innovation is one of the important dynamic is also to have a leader and leadership skills, and it actually showed throughout our conversation that you do care about people, and that's where I believe women are great leaders, because we are the nurturers. We like to make sure that everybody's looked after. So I would like to thank you very much for today's session, and I highly recommend your podcast, which is
Women Who Code Radio. Just released a new episode yesterday.
Excellent. What is the newest episode about?
Two women who were aspiring professional musicians and realized that they needed to make a positive economic change for themselves, and did a boot camp and called the Ada Developers Academy, based up in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle. And now they're both Google interns. So it's people come into tech from all sorts of places.
Are they in your team or somewhere else?
One is in my group. The other one works for Google Maps, I believe. The previous episode was a woman who got a bachelor's degree in library sciences and is now an engineering director at Zapier. So like I said, it's diversity of sourcing. There's so much opportunity in the world, and just helping each other find the right ones for each other is kind of the point of the podcast.
And we've got a network we can use, and we can definitely join another Positivity Hack Deliver next Wednesday at 6 o'clock. Thank you very much, Tara, for your great insights. Tara can be found on LinkedIn. Tara can be found on her podcast, Woman in Tech Radio, as well as you are actually today. I found your Wikipedia page, so everybody can track you down. Well done, Tara. Thank you very much for this very innovative discussion, and I hope you stay well. Women in Tech, hack the future.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.